Welcome. Today, why what other people think can decide so much for you and what actually helps. I'm Vasilis Sampalis, psychologist and clinical neuropsychologist. First of all, where caring about what other people think comes from. The drive to form and keep close relationships is a fundamental human need. People who don't have stable, close attachments with other people have worse mental and physical health. People lay in a brain scanner and played a virtual ball game with what they thought were two other players. Actually, a computer program. First, they were included in the game normally, and then the other players stopped throwing them the ball and kept passing it between themselves for about 45 throws. The dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, which is a brain region that is tied to the distress of physical pain, was more active during the social exclusion than during the inclusion, passing the ball. The more excluded people felt, the more strongly that region activated. You're built to respond to social rejection. Self-esteem picks up on rejection. It is not really a feeling about yourself, but it tracks how much other people seem to value being connected to you. When you sense rejection, self-esteem drops sharply, but when you sense acceptance, it rises, but less. The drop hurts, and that hurt pushes you toward whatever might bring the social connection back. This works without your noticing. Self-esteem is more sensitive to signs of rejection than to signs of acceptance because missing a real rejection costs more than thinking you have been rejected when you have not. A history of rejection, even small moments of feeling valued less, turns up your sensitivity to future signs of rejection. You catch them earlier than someone whose acceptance has rarely been doubted. It's natural to care about what other people think, and many people care but don't get crushed by it. And the difference is what your self worth depends on. Self worth can depend on different things. Some are internal, like living up to your own values, and others are external, like looking good, getting other people's approval, doing better than other people. And the external ones depend on what other people see and prefer. College students whose self-worth depended on appearance had more stress, more aggression, more drug and alcohol use, and more symptoms of disordered eating. Students whose self-worth depended on internal things, on the other hand, like living up to your own values, had less. And winning approval doesn't fix it. Self-esteem that depends on success stays high only as long as the successes keep coming. For example, for the same student applying to PhD programs, self-esteem rose on the days they got an acceptance and fell on the days they got a rejection. The more their self-esteem depended on academics, the bigger the swings. And some high achievers don't feel like they earned it. They attribute their wins to luck or to help from others, and they feel like frauds, afraid of being found out, what's called imposter syndrome. It often comes with anxiety and depression, and at work it shows up as burnout. A lot of this comes down to how affection was given when you were growing up. Children don't yet have what adults do. They can't change their behavior to fit in better. They can't find other accepting people, and they can't tell themselves that the rejection is not really about them, that mom had a bad day or that the friend was just envious. Researchers asked university students whether their parents had given them more affection when they did well in school, sports, being kind to others, or holding back anger, fear, or sadness, and less affection when they didn't. Students whose parents had given affection this way showed the pattern years later, feeling driven to keep doing the things their parents had cared about, self-esteem that moved up and down with how well they were doing, and shame after failure, low self-worth, a sense that their parents disapproved of them, and resentment towards those parents. That feeling is internal pressure. Your parents' conditional affection turned into a sense that you have to behave in specific ways to be worthy. Pressure to control your emotions when there's no need, and something inside that forces you to be overly sensitive to other people's needs or feelings. A need to keep working hard that makes you give up what you want. The satisfaction after success is short lived, and the pressure to meet the next demand takes over. And this pattern got passed down. Mothers whose own parents had given more affection when they did well at school and less affection when they didn't were the same mothers their now adult daughters described as doing the same thing with them. This is common, and the parents who do it generally believe it's good for the child. And parents are not the only source. The same dynamic shows up with siblings, peers, and romantic partners. What you internalize from those relationships are messages about your self worth. Over time, you start seeing the people in them as more judgmental and critical than they are. Your sense of self is fragile and split. You feel unworthy and ashamed. Romantic relationships carry some of the most impactful experiences of acceptance and rejection people have. The same pressure also comes from specific settings and from society as a whole. In some roles, you're expected to live up to extreme expectations with your performance visible to other people, like doctors, nurses, teachers, parents, coaches. People in those roles describe a sense of duty and obligation that always seems present and the feeling of always being judged. Underneath all of this is a fear based on anticipation, fear of falling short of what's expected of you. What you feel others expect from you may not match what they actually expect. The pressure has become your own. Your self worth got attached to other people's approval, and you did not choose it. College students today are more perfectionistic than 3 decades ago, demanding perfection from yourself, demanding perfection from others, and feeling that others demand perfection of you. All three kinds of perfectionism have risen, but all three are angles of the same orientation, a self always trying to measure up. When the measuring points at yourself, you set unrealistic standards and punish yourself when you fall short. When it points at others, you have unrealistic standards for the people who matter to you, expect things done flawlessly, and have no patience for people who won't push themselves. When they fall short, you blame and criticize them, and the people closest to you feel it. When it projects outward, you feel that others demand perfection of you. And this angle of perfectionism has risen most. It's gone up steadily since 1989. By 2017, two-thirds of students scored higher than the average 1989 student. People feel trapped in standards they can't meet. It's tied to depression and suicide. The measuring came from somewhere. Over the last 3 decades, achievement, money, and status got tied to whether you were enough as a person. Education got more competitive, and parents felt the pressure too. On top of their own sense of duty to succeed, they now felt responsible for the successes and failures of their own children. Between 1986 and 2006, parents asked their teenagers more often where they were going and what they were doing. All this measuring rests on the same belief that achievement is what makes a person worth something. Now let's focus on the gap between what you fear and what's actually there. You think you stand out more than you do. Students walked into a room wearing an embarrassing t shirt and guessed how many of the people in the room would notice. Afterward, those people were asked, and those who wore the t shirt predicted 46%, but only 23% actually noticed, exactly half of what they expected. The same pattern happened in a group discussion. Students predicted from memory how the rest of the group would rank them on what they said, and thought that their best comments and worst slip ups in the conversation stood out more than they actually did. In an embarrassing moment, your own experience of it is intense. You're consumed with what's happening to you. When you imagine how it looked from outside, you start from inside that intense experience, and you don't pull back enough to see what others saw. When researchers gave students 15 minutes alone to get used to wearing the embarrassing t shirt before walking into the room, their estimates dropped. The t shirt was less on their mind, so they assumed it would be less noticeable to others. In another study, two strangers were paired up to talk for a few minutes, and afterward each rated how much they liked the other person and how much they thought the other person had liked them. Across 5 studies, they underestimated how much the other person had actually liked them. The signals were right there to see. Third party observers watching videos of the conversations could tell how much each person actually liked the other, but the people in the conversation could not. They were too focused on critical thoughts about their own performance and they projected those thoughts onto the other person. Same pattern with vulnerable moments. Students read scenarios about confessing feelings, admitting a mistake, or showing a physical insecurity, and they read each scenario twice, once picturing themselves doing it, and once picturing a fictional character. Whichever order students read them, they viewed the vulnerable moment more positively when it was the fictional character. You show up expecting more eyes on you and harsher judgment than is there. Now, what keeps the pattern stuck? One thing that keeps it going is comparison. People answered how often they compared themselves to others based on attractiveness, intelligence, wealth, fitness, and personality. And the more often they compared, the more envy, guilt, and defensiveness they felt, and the more often they lied, both to protect themselves and to protect other people's feelings. How much they liked themselves had nothing to do with any of it. How much comparison hurts depends on how happy you usually feel. College students filled out a questionnaire describing how happy they generally felt. And then they each taught a short lesson and heard how they did from someone who had been watching. Some were also taught how the other person doing the same lesson had done. For the less happy students, hearing that someone else did better hurt them, even when they themselves had been taught that they did well. But hearing that someone else did worse helped, even when they themselves had been taught that they did poorly. For the happier students, what the other person did barely affected them. Their mood moved with the feedback they got about how they did. Social media is full of chances to compare yourself. People who spent more time on Facebook had lower self esteem and they were comparing themselves more often to people doing better than them. This study was published in 2014 when Facebook was still alive. And students who viewed the social media profile with lots of likes and comments felt worse about themselves than students who viewed the social media profile with few. Caring what other people think also shows up around specific moments. Sometimes the moment has not even happened and you're already replaying past ones, what you said, what went wrong, or what they thought of you. For some people, the managing gets physical. You stiffen your arm muscles so your hands don't shake, or you grip whatever you're holding tightly. You speak as little as possible to avoid getting words wrong. These are safety behaviors. And safety behaviors do two things. One, when the bad thing does not happen, you tell yourself it's because of what you did, and not because the bad thing was not going to happen anyway. The fear never gets tested. Two, some of them backfire. For example, stiffening up to control the shaking makes the shaking worse, or speaking little to avoid getting words wrong means the other person gives you less positive feedback. Socially anxious students had two short conversations with a stranger. During the first, they held in mind the memory of feeling anxious in a social situation, and during the second conversation, a memory of feeling relaxed. With the anxious memory in mind, they felt more anxious, they used more safety behaviors, and they thought they had come across as worse. And the stranger thought so too. And both rated the conversation itself as worse. The picture you have of yourself in your head shapes how the moment goes. When you're focused on the impression you make on other people, social situations feel more anxious. When you're focused on how you're coming across, you stop noticing what the other person is actually doing. And once the moment has passed, the replay starts. You find things that confirmed you'd performed badly and that they were judging you. Bad events hit harder and stay longer than good ones, in mood and memory. The 5 seconds you misread the room outweigh the 55 minutes the conversation went fine. You can have a good evening and remember it as a bad evening because of the one thing. And also, the managing does not stop with a single event. It runs across whole relationships. When you give in to your partner, it's for one of two reasons. Either you want them to be happy and want to feel closure, or you can't bear them being upset with you. For 2 weeks, college students in dating relationships kept daily diaries of what they gave in on each day, why, and how they felt. On days the giving in was about avoiding the partner being upset, they felt sadder across their whole life, not just the relationship. And when it was about making them happy, they didn't. A month later, the couples whose giving in had mostly been about avoiding upset were more likely to have broken up. After 3 months, the relationships built on avoiding upset had gotten worse for both partners. And outside observers watching the same couples have a short conversation picked up on it from a few minutes alone. Those couples came across as less satisfied and less attentive to each other. Another point of view. College students sat in a room with several other students, and they were shown a line, and then they were asked which of three other lines was the same length. It was obvious which one matched, but the other students, actually working with the experimenter, gave the same wrong answer aloud, and about a third of the time, the real participant went along with them. And afterward, in interviews, some participants said they had gone along knowing the answer was wrong, but they could not bear being the only one to disagree. And the same pattern may show up in other moments, where you avoid upsetting other people, laughing at the joke you did not find funny, or agreeing with an opinion you generally don't agree with, or you say yes when you wanted to say no. This is a focus on other people that costs you yourself, putting their needs first and helping even when it hurts you. Your sense of self worth depends on them, which pulls you too deep into their lives and away from your own. There is a feeling underneath a lot of this: shame. The pull is to keep yourself out of sight. That can look like withdrawing or like the opposite, being so useful to other people that no one ever sees who you really are. What actually helps? Two practices reduce how much your self worth depends on others' approval. And neither one stops the reaction, but they change what you do with it. First of all, self compassion when you fail. Undergraduates wrote about a negative event from their past, something that involved failure, humiliation, or rejection. And then they were split into groups. The self compassion group did three writing exercises. First, list ways other people also experience events like this, to remember that you are not the only one this happens to. Second, Write a paragraph to yourself with understanding, kindness, and concern, the same way you'd write to a friend if this had happened to them. And third, describe how you felt about the event objectively and unemotionally. The self-esteem group did 3 writing exercises to make them feel good about themselves. They wrote down their positive characteristics, what made them competent and valuable. They explained why the event was not entirely their fault and interpreted it in a way that made them feel better about themselves. And they wrote about why the event did not really indicate anything about the kind of person they are. The self compassion group felt less bad about what had happened than the self esteem group. They also thought that the event was more caused by the kind of person they are, their personality, their abilities, attitudes, and character. And now you may ask that normally, when people think a negative event was about who they are, they'd feel worse for it. But in the self compassion group, that connection was broken. They could own that they were people who make mistakes without feeling badly about it because making mistakes is a common experience. So, self compassion is not the same as self esteem. People with more self compassion had steadier feelings about themselves over time and less tied to how things were going. They compared themselves to others less. They were less focused on how they were coming across to others. They ruminated less. And self esteem went with narcissism, self compassion didn't. Self esteem moves with how well or badly things are going, and self compassion holds steadier. Self compassion activates on failure. The kindness comes because you failed, not despite it, and that's why it holds when self esteem can't. When something happens you feel bad about, sit down and write. Actually, write, not think, about 3 things. One, list ways other people also experience events like this, to remember that you're not the only one. Two, write to yourself with understanding, kindness, and concern, the way you try to a friend if this had happened to them. And three, describe how you felt about the event objectively and unemotionally. That's it. Self compassion because you failed, not in spite of it. The second practice is reconnecting to something else that matters. Some college students were asked to reflect on a value they cared about, their religion, their politics, a cause they believed in. And others reflected on a value that mattered to them the least. And then both groups went through 2 stressful tasks. First, a 5 minute speech making a case for why they'd be a good candidate for a competitive job at their university. And then 5 minutes of counting backwards out loud from 2083, subtracting 13 each time, in front of 2 people who were trained to look stern and unaccepting. And the students who had reflected on a value that mattered had less of the stress hormone cortisol in their saliva than the others. Similar exercises have been studied across many situations where people felt their sense of self under threat, being judged, getting bad news, or being criticized. And typically, people pick a value that matters to them and write briefly about why it matters and the time when it was important. And they were less defensive, they could see past the threat. A single brief session of doing this has produced effects lasting months. When something threatens you, your attention locks onto the threat. Reflecting on something you care about, something the situation cannot touch, reminds you that you're more than what's actually being judged right now, and the threat may not go away, but it just stops being the only thing in front of you. When the moment feels like everything, reconnect to something else that matters. Before a moment where you feel you'll be judged, take a few minutes, write down a value that actually matters to you, the thing that you'd say if no one was listening, like family, the work I'm building, being loyal to my friends, honesty, pick something separate from the situation you're going into and write a few sentences about why it matters and the time when it was important to you. When the wave hits, when you can't stop replaying it or thinking about it does not help you, three techniques have research backing. First of all, naming what you're feeling, like saying humiliated or rejected, for example, calms the amygdala, the brain region that fires when you feel threatened. And in the study, participants looked at photos of faces showing negative emotions and chose a word to label the emotion, like scared or angry. And their amygdala was less active when labeling than during other tasks with the same images. Putting emotion into words engages a brain region that calms the amygdala. Another thing is to take a negative thought running in your head, something self critical that bothers you, like, I'm too fat, and restate it in one word, fat, and then repeat that word out loud as fast as you can for 30 seconds. And right after, the word feels less meaningful and the thought feels less believable and less uncomfortable. Thirdly, silently reflect on a hard memory you keep coming back to, a moment you felt rejected, embarrassed, or betrayed, and try to understand the feelings using your own first name and you instead of I. Like, Vasilis, why are you feeling this way? Instead of, why am I feeling this way? And this makes the memory feel less negative, even for extremely negative memories. These reduce the intensity of the response when it happens, but they don't change what triggers it. Finally, what changes? Your own source of worth separate from theirs. Some life goals point outward, like money, fame, or looking attractive, and others point inward, like personal growth, close relationships, and your community. People whose central goals were outward had worse well being than people whose central goals were inward. The outward group had worse well being, whether they were pursuing those goals because they wanted to or because they felt they had to. Researchers asked people what they wanted to achieve in life, and then checked back a year later. The people who got richer, more famous, and better looking did not feel any happier, and sometimes they felt worse, more anxious, with physical symptoms and lower mood. The people who got more of the inward goals felt better. Authenticity is three things: it's living by your values and beliefs, having your own mind when other people push you, and feeling in touch with your real self. Authentic people had less anxiety and stress and were more satisfied with their lives. Self worth can fluctuate with what's happening to you, or it can hold steady. Stable self worth comes from successfully dealing with life challenges, from your true self shaping what you do, and from relationships where you're valued for who you are and not for what you achieve. For 2 weeks, college students kept a daily diary, and every night they wrote down the three activities they'd spent the most time on, the reasons they had done each, and the three social interactions they had spent the most time on, and how they felt. They felt better on the days they did things because they purely enjoyed them or because those activities expressed their true values. And on the days they had meaningful conversations and felt understood and appreciated. For the same person across different days, the days they did things they enjoyed or that expressed their true values and felt understood and appreciated were the days that felt better. Those are the days that feel more like yours. You still want others to like you, but you have your own mind when they push, and your self worth stops coming from them. If this helped, there's more coming. Leave a like, if you want more people to find it, and subscribe if you want to see the next one. Comments are open. Thanks.